Stephen, a full-time hunter and gourmet, arrived in Alaska's Brooks Range, one of the most desolate places in the world. He traveled by plane with his friend Brant, a waterfowl biologist. Upon arrival, their first task was to set up their tent and scout the surroundings. According to Alaskan law, hunting on the same day as flying is prohibited, so they explored along the lake until nightfall before returning to camp. The next morning, they set out during the mating season for moose, when males roam in search of a mate. They planned to attract the moose by mimicking their calls using a tool Brant had, which accurately replicated the moose's sound, and by knocking branches together to simulate the sound of antlers rubbing. Their setup was perfect, but instead of a moose, a grizzly bear appeared, spoiling their plans as moose are highly vigilant and avoid bears. They decided to relocate to a higher mountain for a better vantage point. Upon arrival, Stephen spotted 2 moose by the lake, but they were too young and not suitable for their hunt. They continued moving around the mountain, but had no luck by sunset. The next day, before continuing their moose hunt, they planned to catch some fish for food. The lake was abundant with a type of fish ideal for frying. After a successful fishing session, they climbed to the highest peak, where Stephen prepared lunch by frying the fish, which turned out deliciously tender and tasty. Unfortunately, their culinary success did not translate to hunting luck. As the sun set, they returned empty-handed. By the 6th day, they had not caught any moose, and their initial enthusiasm had waned, but they continued their search. Eventually, their patience paid off as they spotted several moose and quickly pursued them. When they got close, Stephen made noise, startling the moose into running. Brant tried to shoot, but didn't feel it was the right moment. He mimicked the moose call again, causing them to pause briefly, but as he aimed, they started running again. Brant tried to repeat his trick, but the moose ignored him. In his eagerness to follow, Brant clumsily fell, missing a great opportunity, which frustrated him greatly. Stephen was also visibly upset. This was their only significant opportunity in 6 days, leaving them feeling utterly disheartened. After lifting their spirits, they followed the stream back to camp. Along the way, they spotted a moose about 2 miles away, but with daylight fading, they had to wait until the next morning to track it. The next morning, they returned to yesterday's location, and fortunately, the moose was still active nearby. To increase their chances, they split up. Brant moved into the bushes while Stephen positioned himself in an open area to keep an eye on the moose. Brant could see the moose and began aiming as soon as he saw half of its body, then decisively fired. Startled, the moose quickly vanished from sight, but Brant was confident he had hit his target. They began searching cautiously, aware that a wounded moose could be dangerous. They found some hair but no blood, indicating the bullet might have missed. Brant was deeply disappointed, especially with only 2 days left in their hunt. Deciding to maximize their chances, they split up again. Stephen went to a nearby mountaintop to observe, while Brant stayed near camp to continue calling moose. Fortune favored Stephen, who spotted a mature bull moose. He rushed back to camp but didn't find Brant, who had also spotted the moose and was tracking it. To avoid disturbing him, Stephen stayed put. Eventually, Brant located the moose, but had to wait until dawn due to fading light. At dawn, they resumed their calls, hoping to attract the moose. After an hour with no sign of it, Stephen went to higher ground with binoculars and spotted the moose a few miles away. He used an antler to earnestly call it, which worked as the moose turned around. Stephen signaled for Brant to hurry over. They converged and moved quickly towards the moose, calling out periodically. Together, they managed to get the moose within shooting range. After a long wait, Brant took aim and fired when the moose stopped. Seeing it was not yet down, he fired again, and this time, the moose fell. They approached their catch, and, seeing its robust condition, felt a deep sense of relief. After a week of waiting and a brief rest, they quickly butchered the moose and packed the meat into categories, loading everything onto 2 kayaks. The pair then paddled downstream, starting their journey back. By noon, they felt hungry, so they stopped to fish and skewer some of the venison, grilling it over charcoal. They did the same with the fish. After a while, the delicious aroma filled the air, and they heartily enjoyed their meal, finding it exceptionally satisfying. This hunting trip ended perfectly with Stephen, a full-time hunter and gourmet, bagging a moose and enjoying several hundred pounds of its meat, including tenderloins that he savored as skewers. Stephen had come to the Amazon basin in South America to experience indigenous hunting methods. The jungle stretched for miles, filled with dangers. Invited by business partners, Stephen arrived in a region inhabited by the Tisman people, who were curious about his presence. After discussing with two associates, he headed to the riverbank, where transportation was primarily by boat. Locals, hired cheaply by traders, quickly prepared all necessary materials for the journey. Stephen's purpose here was to follow the natives' lead, experience their lifestyle, and learn hunting skills. He felt as if he had stepped back into the 19th century, taking an old boat far from urban noise and enjoying the scenic route, which was incredibly relaxing. As the river narrowed and the trees thickened, indicating their approach to the mountains, they stopped for a break and a cigarette before continuing. Due to heavy rain the previous night, the river was murky. Stephen noticed a mountain peak in the distance, their primitive destination, unexplored by most Germans. When the river grew wild, they stopped. There was a village where they planned to hire another helper. Most items in the village were made from natural materials, piquing Stephen's curiosity. A man named Alberto, an experienced hunter carrying homemade bows and arrows for hunting different types of prey, including fish, birds, and land animals, approached them. Alberto demonstrated his expert archery, hitting every target, and Stephen also tried shooting an arrow. The gap wasn't large. Although they did not speak the same language, smiles were universally understood. After a joyful interaction, they embarked on their journey. Alberto's equipment was simple: a grain sack, a bow with arrows, and an old shotgun. However, before heading into the jungle, they needed to visit a village. Pacheni village provided wheel grease for their journey due to business interactions, requiring a brief stop. The village had a garden cultivating local fruits and various imported and medicinal plants. They crushed leaves from a Barbados plant containing a small amount of toxin, which, while not lethal to fish, made them extremely uncomfortable and caused them to float to the surface. After collecting enough leaves, they set off by boat to a temporary holding pond, a tributary. They blocked the exit to prevent fish from escaping, then added the leaves to the water and rubbed them to release the toxins. Soon, they observed fish floating up in a dazed state. Stephen, curious, tried to catch a fish with his hands, but it slipped away. The Tisman people suggested using bows and arrows for fishing, timing their shots for a precise hit. They were expert archers, hitting their targets with remarkable accuracy, making this an excellent way to train children in archery. Stephen was amazed by the experience, and soon they had caught over 20 fish, ready to move to the next location. Before leaving, the Tisman people engaged in a traditional custom of chewing leaves. These were coca leaves containing cocaine, a stimulant for the central nervous system, a key ingredient in Coca-Cola, and a raw material for narcotic drugs. The locals enjoyed chewing coca leaves, often mixing them with baking soda to make them more palatable. After this, they set off again, facing a perilous journey upstream. The boatmen exerted great effort against the current, manually clearing obstructing stones. Overcoming these challenges, they safely navigated the dangerous river sections and continued rowing until they reached their destination at a base camp by the jungle entrance. Since it was still early in the day, the group took Stephen fishing a few miles from the base camp at a deep water hole. Despite the murky water, the area was home to large fish. One hunter, quick and precise, speared a small fish to use as bait for bigger fish. They tied the fish slices to hooks and began fishing. An hour later, a local's rod bent under the weight of a massive green catfish. Ugly, yet formidable. Stephen examined it with curiosity. This large catch seemed to open the doors of luck, and soon another fish was on the hook. This time, an even more impressive local legend known as the Dorado fish. The Dorado fish, covered in stunning golden hues, was quite rare. To protect the species, they decided to release it back into the water. However, the large green catfish did not share the same fate and was kept for dinner, marking the start of an interesting adventure. Tonight, Stephen and two hunters would explore the jungle. What stories would unfold? Stephen had arrived in the Amazon basin, following the locals and experiencing the joy of fishing. As evening approached, hunting began. Due to the alertness of the local wildlife, only a select few could participate. They chose Marco and Alberto, the best hunters, to join Stephen. As a top hunter, Stephen had encountered dozens of species in his lifetime, but the next 15 minutes would completely redefine his experience and open his mind to this journey. For their target was a monkey. Alberto, using an old Russian shotgun, followed the monkey's movements, looking for the right moment to shoot. The opportunity came quickly, and Alberto took the decisive shot. The monkey struggled for a few seconds at the treetops before falling to the ground, leaving Stephen breathless and staring in shock as Marco retrieved it from the brush. Although prepared, seeing the monkey's face left Stephen with indescribable feelings. The natives, accustomed to such scenes, did not react. But for Stephen, it was the moment he truly understood what meat hunting entailed. The locals had killed a primate for food, a concept difficult for him to accept, though he understood it was for survival. Yet he was still shocked, finding it hard to look directly at the hunters. Stephen wrestled with the idea of eating the monkey. If offered as a gesture of hospitality, should he accept or decline? He muttered to himself, somewhat delirious, thankful that the locals could not understand his words, as the consequences might be severe. As the fire increased the surrounding temperature, Stephen still felt a chill. He imagined the monkey watching him. His reverie was interrupted as a native expertly placed the monkey on the fire to singe off its hair. Compared to yesterday's panic, Stephen's demeanor had improved significantly. He watched calmly as the natives removed the fur, and after scraping it off, they moved to the river to rinse away any debris. Stephen reassured himself, this is just a pig, a common method of processing pigs. Under this mental guise, he started to relax and even joke around. His friends informed him that monkeys, primarily eating nuts and fruits, tasted much better than pork. After the preparations, the monkey's hair was gone, and its joints were cracked open. Marco tied up the monkey, much like trussing a chicken. He then built a rack over the fire and placed the monkey on it to smoke for 8 hours, similar to roasting a suckling pig. By evening, the monkey was almost ready, and Alberto began preparing a stew, adding the smoked meat to a pot. They chopped the meat into pieces and added it to the stew. To enhance the flavor, they mashed plantain pulp and used it as a seasoning, pouring it all into the stew. After simmering over high heat, the stew thickened and was ready to be served. Everyone had a bowl of the delicious stew. Stephen tried a piece of the meat, which was rubbery and very chewy, and found the flavor quite mediocre. Seeing the natives enjoying it thoroughly, Stephen gradually let go, deciding to fully immerse himself in the local customs. While he would not hunt monkeys after leaving, he respected the local culture and chose to experience this lifestyle as his best option at the moment. After the meal, it was time for evening hunting. It was 5 o'clock, prime time for animals to be active. During the day, the natives had placed salt in certain areas, which some animals came to lick. The hunting team, still composed of 3 people, set out as night fell and the jungle became a terrifying place, filled with eerie noises, instilling fear. The natives constantly made squeaking sounds, seemingly calling some animal. Stephen, unsure what they were hunting, did not dare to ask, fearing he might disrupt their rhythm. Soon, Stephen was bitten by a bullet ant, causing excruciating pain that made him grimace. The jungle was indeed full of dangers, and the pain from the tiny ant felt as severe as a bee sting. As he tried to walk, the pain at the bite site throbbed, eventually causing his heart to race. He had to stop. Marco disappeared for a moment, but returned with some vines, which he crushed with a knife and applied to Stephen's wound. Stephen lay down to rest, feeling terrible. After some time, his condition improved significantly, but continuing to hunt seemed unlikely. Not recognizing the way back, he had to hobble along, enduring until late at night. By then, his pain had subsided so much that he could hardly remember which foot was injured. His perseverance paid off, as the thrilling night hunt was about to begin. Soon, the jungle brought a surprise. The South American natives had hunted another monkey and made it into a stew, a method that deeply shocked Stephen. But to respect local customs, he decided to adapt. He tasted it, experiencing the life of the natives. Nighttime was a hunting feast. Stephen ventured deeper into the jungle with the two hunters, surrounded by various loud noises that added a spooky atmosphere. The trio, armed with flashlights, searched continuously. They spotted small animals like opossums, but the natives showed no reaction, likely seeking larger prey. Due to the language barrier, Stephen kept his questions to himself and silently followed their lead. They sometimes communicated through gestures, and Stephen guessed he might have been scolded for scaring away potential game due to his inexperience. The natives were fully engaged in hunting mode. One of them signaled Stephen to turn off his flashlight, and the atmosphere became tense, as if even the sounds had vanished. A gunshot broke the silence, and noise resumed. Stephen quickly readied his bow and arrow, and an animal flashed by. He released an arrow decisively but seemed to miss. They hurried after it, and by the time they saw the prey again, it had already fallen in the bushes. Stephen put away his bow and arrow. It was a Brocket deer, small and native to the jungle. To prevent the innards from rotting, they decided to process the deer on the spot. To avoid attracting predators with the scent of blood, Alberto loaded his shotgun. After removing the deer's innards, Marco peeled a layer of bark from a tree to use as rope, tying up the deer and slinging it over his shoulder for the return journey. Back at camp, they continued to butcher the deer. Sharpening a small knife, they quickly cut the deer into quarters with swift, deft movements. They washed the pieces in the pure river water. Along with the deer, the other natives had been busy night fishing, catching several large catfish, which they also processed by the river, using salt to preserve the fish meat. The day's bounty was substantial, and smiles filled the natives' faces. The next day, a light rain fell, but the bad weather did not affect their appetite. Marco was building a shelter to cover the cooking area, while Alberto prepared the ingredients. Once the fire was lit, they placed deer meat and fish heads on a rack. The deer meat still had skin and fur, which they said would preserve its original flavor when smoked. Though this contradicted Stephen's understanding. He felt this was completely wrong, but as a guest, he remained silent, respecting local culture. Eager to taste it, it wasn't long before Stephen held a piece of deer meat in his hand, smeared with butter and heavily salted. Surprisingly, it tasted quite good, unexpectedly delicious. The catfish was made into a stew similar to the previous monkey dish. It seems that plantains are an essential ingredient here. Combined, they create a thick consistency similar to porridge. The group heartily enjoyed the meal, and, after breakfast, set off again to fish in a very clear tributary where the fish were visible. It was now time to test their archery skills. Marco aimed slightly and released an arrow, striking a fish directly through the heart. Stephen, not to be outdone, tried his hand, but his archery skills were lacking. However, this amusing scene brought the two men closer together as they continued with laughter and conversation. Despite the language barrier, hunting was a shared passion, enough for them to communicate. Seeing Marco's flawless shots inspired Stephen, and after 3 attempts, he finally hit a fish. Once the rain cleared and visibility improved, the river was teeming with fish. Both men grew more enthusiastic, and even Stephen achieved a satisfying catch. Pleased with their efforts, they headed back. Today was their last day at the camp, planned with a feast using the freshly caught big fish, which was simply seasoned with salt and grilled. While they fished, other hunters caught several large birds, plucked and skinned them, then cut them up and cooked them in a spicy sauce with added water to make another stew. Meanwhile, the deer meat, smoked throughout the day, was now perfectly flavored. Everyone had a clear role, busily tending to the food, and soon the campsite was filled with various delicious aromas. Once everything was ready, it was time to sit down and enjoy the feast. Everyone's effort contributed to a camaraderie that deeply touched Stephen. Although it was just a short interaction, Stephen gained a deeper understanding of this simple community and had endless praise for their cuisine. Marco, caught up in the moment, began humming a tune, enhancing the festive atmosphere. Stephen was very satisfied with the trip, having spent an unforgettable time, and found it hard to leave. Stephen, a full-time hunter and gourmet, had come today to the narrow plains of Texas to hunt a few sandhill cranes. KAS 150 years ago, this area was a dense grassland inhabited by numerous bison, but excessive mining and hunting led to their disappearance along with the grasslands. In their place now were fields of wheat, cotton, and sorghum, attracting hundreds of thousands of sandhill cranes to winter here. Accompanying him was his good friend Ronnie, a professional dog trainer with 25 years of hunting experience, and they were invited by Ed, a biologist dedicated to the study and conservation of birds. For this trapping operation, they prepared several sandhill crane decoys filled with wood and foam. The crane skins were used to achieve a highly realistic effect. The next morning, they drove to their location and started preparations. They placed sandhill crane decoys on the ground and set up several blinds. After their work, as dawn broke, they noticed birds appearing in the sky. The group quickly hid and waited patiently. Birds tend to flock together, and if they noticed similar birds on the ground, they might join them. This was exactly the hunters' trap. The hunters waited confidently, but the birds thwarted their efforts. Despite the hunters' calls, the birds ignored them and flew straight away. Before they could even sigh in disappointment, another group of birds flew by, also at too high an altitude for shooting. Over the next few hours, they watched batch after batch of birds, all out of shooting range. Just as they were about to doze off, a group of birds flew low enough to engage. They immediately sat up and opened fire continuously, seizing this rare opportunity. Despite their vigorous efforts, they surprisingly did not hit any birds, leading to an awkward atmosphere. However, soon 3 birds appeared in the sky. With fewer targets, it was easier to focus. Stephen and Ronnie each hit a bird. They joyfully retrieved their game, fat sandhill cranes. With not much daylight left, they decided to collect the decoys and return the next day. The next morning, they tried a new hiding technique. After setting up the decoys, they hid in ditches and covered themselves with hay for better camouflage. Unfortunately, a thick fog rolled in, almost as if nature was thwarting their hunting. All they could do was wait for the weather to improve. Unexpectedly, a flock of birds headed their way, flying low. Stephen fired the first shot, and a sandhill crane fell directly. The other cranes also landed following the shot. The gunfire continued as they shot one after another, thoroughly enjoying themselves. After a fruitful harvest, they felt hungry and took out a portable grill to prepare lunch. Meanwhile, Ed noticed a tag on the leg of one of the shot cranes. It was a marker used by wildlife organizations worldwide to track migratory birds. They called a number and reported the series of numbers. After checking the data, they were informed that this bird was registered in Alaska 12 years ago. Since it was a legal hunt, they would not face any penalties. Instead, because they had recorded valuable migration data, they would be awarded a certificate. After finishing their main tasks, they started cooking. They cut 2 pieces of meat from the crane, rubbed them with olive oil and some seasonings, then placed them on the grill. After a short while, they flipped the meat to check its doneness. Once confirmed cooked, they used a knife to cut the meat into several portions. Everyone eagerly tasted it. The meat was tender and delicious, almost melting in the mouth. Stephen exclaimed with delight, noting that the taste of the meat was more like tender beef than poultry. The next day, they returned to the same spot to continue waiting for the birds. It was another gray day, which actually provided better camouflage. Soon, a flock of cranes appeared. The group stood up and fired continuously, successfully harvesting 3 cranes. Their luck continued as more flocks appeared, and they showcased their shooting skills, with one crane after another falling. Ultimately, everyone had a full harvest. Now that they had enough, they packed up all their belongings and returned to the farm. Next came the culinary segment. They quickly skinned the birds and extracted the tender meat. Stephen started preparing delicious kebabs. He skewered the meat and heart, adding several vegetable skewers as well. He then made a seasoning with butter, lemon, and chili, which he brushed onto the skewers. Finally, he sprinkled some salt and pepper. Throughout the grilling process, he continuously applied butter to the skewers because the game meat was lean and lacked fat. Soon, the kebabs were ready and everyone enjoyed them heartily. The scene was very warm, and they spent an unforgettable evening. These animals, resembling the mythical ox king, are called Muskoxen. Now, a hunter has set his sights on them. With a gunshot, the Muskoxen frantically ran away. This stunning scene unfolded in the wilderness of Alaska. Stephen, a full-time hunter and gourmet, came today to Nunivak Island, Alaska, to visit the local Inuit people. This is the only village on the island, with a population of less than 200. Their main livelihood is hunting, including hunting caribou, fishing for salmon, picking berries, and hunting seals and walruses. Winter also brings an important activity: hunting Muskoxen. Outsiders can participate, but must enter a lottery to compete for the 5% chance and hire a local guide. James is the guide Stephen hired, and his partner Raymond is the assistant guide. Both were born in Nunivak and have spent their lives hunting and fishing. The three sat down to plan the next day's itinerary with great anticipation, and the following day, they set out on snowmobiles. Today's journey was to the Caribou Burial Ground, where the Inuit people discard the remains after hunting each winter, creating a caribou graveyard that serves as a paradise for foxes. Yet paradise and hell are often separated by a thin line. Since it was essentially a hunter's trap, Stephen lay down to aim. He shot at a red fox, felling it with one bullet. The two approached to inspect it and found it was a mature red fox, much larger than those found inland. Stephen admired its fur and planned to make a coat for his wife. However, the act of killing did not affect the atmosphere. Another fox and a crow soon resumed their scavenging, reflecting the harsh reality of nature. The next day, the local harsh weather taught Stephen a lesson. Due to heavy snow and wind in the southern region, they had to cancel their plans for the day. To pass the time, they decided to go ice fishing, an activity they found quite engaging. They reached a nearby lake, already covered with a thick layer of ice. After much effort exerting brute force, they managed to break through the ice and clear the chunks. James then took out the fishing gear, which did not require bait because the fish hooks could spin and the sinkers were brightly colored, attractive to fish. While Stephen watched skeptically, James quickly pulled up a fish, astonishing him. Eager to try himself, Stephen began fishing and soon caught a small fish. His excitement grew as he fell in love with the sport, catching one small fish after another, thoroughly enjoying himself. A satisfied Stephen then returned home with his catch. James brought out a bottle of seal oil, pouring a bit onto a plate. Stephen couldn't resist the aroma, noticing a refreshing scent. James sliced the fish and Stephen dipped it in the seal oil, tasting it. It was a new experience for him, slightly sweet and initially a bit strange, but he found it increasingly delicious. James explained that in Alaska, seal oil is a staple, essential for staying warm. Eating cod alone, even in large amounts, would still leave one feeling cold. Only with seal oil could one live healthily. On the third day, the sun shone brightly and the Inuit began their morning prayer rituals. Afterwards, they set off by car. The weather was good, and they smoothly arrived in the tundra, a vast land where wildlife could hardly hide. The three used binoculars and soon spotted several muskoxen, though it was unclear if any bulls were among them. They drove closer to the target. Upon nearing the muskoxen, Stephen took out a hunting rifle and proceeded on foot with James. They approached the side of the herd to observe and identify a bull among them. The Muskoxen, noticing the uninvited humans, recognized them but remained calm, confident in their own strength. Stephen raised his rifle and began aiming, finding the process more challenging than expected as the four Muskoxen stayed close together. The Muskoxen formed their most effective defense, a common strategy against wolves. Left with no choice, the two followed the Muskoxen, looking for an opportunity. Local laws allowed them to hunt only bulls, not cows, presenting a significant challenge for Stephen. The chase had already lasted 40 minutes, increasing Stephen's urgency. Then, unexpectedly, a bull stepped out of formation. For a top hunter, such a moment was not to be missed. He decisively fired his gun. The bull curled up within the herd as if nothing had happened, confusing Stephen. The herd then took off in a mad dash with Stephen following. When they finally stopped, he fired again, causing the herd to run once more. This time, however, the situation evolved differently. The bull stumbled and fell. Approaching the downed animal, Stephen could truly appreciate the muskox's size and majesty. Its fur was unusually fluffy, irresistibly touchable. James estimated the bull was 8 years old, in its prime. It took all three of them to roll it over before they began butchering. The bull was fat and healthy, evident from its substantial fat reserves, indicating a good diet. After busy preparation, the bull was fully butchered. They returned home with their bounty, ready for a culinary session. They sliced the beef and prepared various side dishes. Once everything was ready, they stir-fried the beef, added seasonings, and finally, the side dishes, preparing a stew. When they lifted the pot lid, a delicious aroma filled the air. They served the beef over rice, creating an appetizing dish that everyone eagerly enjoyed. The beef was tender and exceptionally tasty, making for a very satisfying experience. Stephen was very pleased with his trip to Alaska, filled with exciting adventures. He had hunted a muskox, securing hundreds of pounds of meat, and also hunted a fox, planning to make a coat for his wife. Stephen, a full-time hunter and gourmet, was back in Southeast Alaska at a fishing and hunting lodge, preparing to hunt a black bear with his friend Paul. But before pursuing the bear, they planned to enjoy some relaxing time setting crab traps. It was early summer, and the weather was exceptionally fine. Their boat drifted with the current as Stephen explained the local conditions to his friend. After their talk, they quickly returned home to prepare for the upcoming hunt. Stephen's plan was to take a speedboat to the bear's territory, then silently switch to a canoe to avoid startling the wildlife. Soon they arrived at their destination and secured their boat in position. After sunbathing until only 1 hour of sunlight remained, they began to move. Across the lake, a wandering black bear was spotted. The two observed every move of the bear, aware that although its sight was not sharp, its sense of smell and hearing were exceptionally good. Fortunately, they were downwind, so the bear did not detect them. Although they could shoot, they chose not to, as it seemed too easy and uninteresting. They returned home by canoe. The next day, they planned to fish for rockfish, targeting 3 types that inhabited the area. Soon, Paul felt a tug on his rod, indicating a small fish. He reeled it in to find a featherback rockfish. Meanwhile, Stephen's rod bent dramatically. After a struggle, he pulled up a plump rockfish. These carnivorous fish often fall for the fisherman's tricks due to their nature. They continued fishing, and soon Stephen got another bite. But this time, to his amusement, he reeled in a sea anemone, which he threw back into the sea. They enjoyed fishing for a while, catching one rockfish after another, filling their plates with satisfaction. Later, they ventured into the territory of the black bear. A small bear watched them curiously from the shore, spared because of its size. Soon, they spotted a large black bear fitting their expectations, but had to be extremely cautious due to the adult bear's volatility. As the bear moved toward the woods, Stephen attempted to lure it by mimicking the sounds of a distressed animal, but the bear likely smelled their presence, and they missed their chance. As dusk fell and for safety reasons, they returned home. The next day, they checked their crab traps and found them full of large, healthy crabs. They needed to process the crabs while fresh, so they promptly headed home, cut up the crabs, washed them thoroughly, and then boiled them in heavily salted water for 10 minutes before bagging them for storage. As night fell, they resumed their hunting. Paddling and keeping a lookout, it took a while before they spotted a bear. They immediately approached the shore and readied a hunting rifle. The bear remained unaware of the danger. Paul was prepared, waiting for Stephen's signal. Stephen, using binoculars, confirmed the bear met their criteria. Paul was ready to shoot, aiming for a clean, ethical kill as a top hunter. After patiently waiting, he finally pulled the trigger. The black bear, startled, began to run quickly. However, Paul was confident he had hit a vital spot. They slowly approached and saw the black bear already lying on the ground, apparently dead. To be certain, Paul prodded it with his rifle to ensure it was no longer alive. Only then did they dare to touch it, feeling the bear's fuzzy fur. Up close, the visual impact of the black bear was truly stunning. After admiring the bear for a moment, they removed its organs and loaded it onto the canoe, then began their journey back. The next day, they continued processing the black bear. They skinned the bear completely and then cut the meat into different parts, packaging it up. Once the hard work was done, it was time to enjoy some delicious food. Stephen made a sauce with brown sugar and prepared bell peppers, pineapple, onions, and cashews to make a pot of side dishes. He chose the most tender loin meat, coated it in starch, and fried it in oil. Once the meat was cooked, he added it to the previously prepared side dishes, stir-fried everything together, and sprinkled some seasonings on top. The dish was then ready to be served. Served with rice, the flavor was outstanding and particularly good with rice, a taste Paul had never experienced before.